In this session, I'd like to have a brief look at what a proverb is, but before then, just to make one or two comments about the structure of the book of Proverbs. Now, you are going to be doing this yourself, and you may have begun on working on this already. So, because the structure is fairly straightforward, I don't need to mention too much about that. But I do want to draw your attention to the first 9 chapters. And in these chapters, we have 9 wisdom poems. Now, some people would divide them up a bit differently, and there would be more. But basically, for our purposes, there are these 9 chapters of wisdom poems. And I would suggest to you, the reason for these is that they're to prepare the reader to be able to benefit from those following chapters. You'll notice in chapter 10, we then have the Proverbs of Solomon, and we begin to have those individual aphorisms where each verse is a proverb all on its own. And so to be able to benefit from these, we have these 9 chapters to prepare the reader for what follows. I would suggest to you that these chapters, among other things, and I think there are a number of things, are heart preparation. And it's not insignificant that the turning point from this particular portion, 1 through 9 to 10, concludes with chapter 9, where there's this magnificent personification of wisdom and foolishness in Lady Wisdom and Lady Foolishness, and the challenge to choose and decide. And one of the assignments you'll see has to do with this chapter, a magnificent poetic piece that is deeply instructive. And this too summarizes in these 2 women all that's been said in 1 through 8, and calls for a decision in the verses in between 7 through 12, preparing for what follows. In Proverbs 1 through 9, I would suggest to you there's 4 keys to be able to engage, enjoy, and benefit from the wisdom. And the first of these we've already mentioned a couple of times, and that is the fear of the Lord. In this portion, it comes 5 times, this phrase comes 5 times, but significantly, it's at the beginning, in 1:7, and at the end, 9:10. It forms, as we saw in poetry, an inclusio between these chapters, like bookends. And as we've seen, without the fear of the Lord, there's no wisdom. People have asked, how come Solomon, with all of his wisdom, would finish his life so badly? How could he do that if he was meant to be the wisest man on earth? And I think as we look at chapter 11 of 1 Kings, what we find is that Solomon lost the fear of the Lord. As his wives came in, we read his heart was turned away from the Lord. And he began, as we saw in Kings, a shift of worldview, a change to embrace their values. And with it, he lost the fear of the Lord. And the tragedy with Solomon is that the end of his life was foolishness rather than wisdom. The foundation is the fear of the Lord. And for true wisdom, our relationship with God is not something that can be surpassed. It is the key and the most important thing. And from that, everything else is built. The second key I want to suggest to you that comes from these chapters is a willingness and an openness to hear and act on advice. 12 times we're exhorted to hear and receive instruction. And as you read these verses, there's specific instruction to listen and respond. If we're not open to listen and hear, then nothing will change. Humility is the key. And these chapters are exhorting humility in the person who's about to embark on gaining wisdom. If we have the fear of the Lord, if we have humility, we're in a good place to benefit and gain from these chapters. The third key is the need to recognize that discipline is a part of learning wisdom. The need to embrace discipline and to be willing to accept discipline. 3:11 and 12. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of his reproof. For the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father in whom he delights. And we find in these chapters this exhortation, and it's really an extension of being willing to hear and listen and obey. Without this biblical meekness, which of course is not weakness, but a brokenness, a willingness to learn, then the wisdom in these pages will not benefit us because we will not embrace it. And lastly, especially chapter 2, we read that we need to have a passion and eagerness and earnestness. And as it says on the screen, the wisdom in this book is not for the casual inquirer, but for the earnest seeker. Proverbs 2 verse 3. Yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. In other words, there needs to be an eagerness, an earnestness, a seeking, and then we will be beneficiaries of the wisdom as we have humble, open hearts to receive the wisdom in this. Back to the structure of Proverbs, to draw your attention to the final part. In chapter 31, 10 to 31, we find an acrostic poem. And you'll remember an acrostic is where the first letter of each line is significant. And in this acrostic, it goes through the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And it's this famous poem of the capable wife. And this becomes a powerful and a fitting conclusion to the book of Proverbs, because in that woman, and remember, wisdom is personified as a wisdom is personified as a woman. In that woman, we see a personification of all that is taught in the book. It's as if everything that's been taught is seen in this woman who is the capable wife. A very powerful and a fitting end to this magnificent book. So what is a proverb? Well, we don't need to spend too much time on this because we know a proverb, we're familiar with proverbs. A proverb is one of those pithy statements which are a reflection or an observation of life. Often in it is a lesson. It's pointing something out that is good to know. And on the screen you see a friend in need is a friend indeed. And proverbs often rhyme, or maybe they have a beat, or maybe they use words that have the same letter at the beginning. And this is true in the book of Proverbs. And sadly, a lot of this is not translatable, but is very evident in the Hebrew, where there's a play on words. There may be a bit of rhyme, meter, maybe letters beginning with the same sound, and that is a feature of Proverbs. And it's the same in each language, and it's the same in English too. All that glitters is not gold. It's another one we may be familiar with. talking about not everything is what it seems. We have to be careful because sometimes things seem to be other than they really are. I've used the word aphorism a number of times. And the word aphorism is a technical word for the two-line proverb that we find from chapter 10 following. And as I've mentioned, in the Hebrew, these are couplets. Often it's the same in English. And in Hebrew, it may be 6 or 7 words. And often it's 3 strong beats answered by another 3. Spare the rod, spoil the child. You notice the S there in both of those lines, giving it a bit of a beat. Spare the rod, spoil the child. A stitch in time saves 9. Here it's got a rhyme as well as a common letter. And this is how Proverbs work. The challenge to bring appropriate discipline to children, or we spoil them. We're not showing love to them. An exhortation to take care of something when the problem's small, because if we don't, the problem will get bigger. Just a note about the aphorisms that come from chapter 10 following. There's no particular order. It's been described that they're a bit like pebbles on a beach. They're just thrown there. And sometimes you can find the groupings of maybe proverbs about the righteous and the wicked. But clearly there's no great organization until you get to the Proverbs that Hezekiah copied, the Proverbs of Solomon that Hezekiah copied, and then you'll see these are in smaller groups that seem to have been put there in an order. Otherwise, there's no order, which is why, incidentally, we're not doing paragraph titles for this book. The first 9 chapters can be paragraph titles and can be done so very well. But 10 following, of course, it would literally mean 1 for every verse, and that would kind of defeat the object, as I'm sure you understand. And so, rather, the assignment is going to be of a different nature for this book.